Okay, hello everyone. This is Regina Hopper with GRIDSMART Technologies, and I have Jason Goldman with IPS America, and we have quite a few attendees here, and we want to thank you all for joining us today to talk about the fact that Washington does in fact have quite an impact on what's going on in the new mobility world as well as the intelligent transportation field. We do want to remind you that you can go to the Q&A button. I believe it's either at the top or the bottom of your screen that will allow you to ask questions, and we will be monitoring those questions and try to get to them at the end of this. So please don't think that we're not looking at your questions. We are. So please feel free to write those questions in, and then we will come back and look at them. Let me introduce Jason Goldman, who is with IPS America. And when I was with IPS America, I was fortunate enough to find him out there. He is an expert in the field of policy and law around both transportation and telecommunications. That is, of course, where intelligent transportation mixes together. And Jason has an extensive background, not only in public policy and law, but also in stakeholder engagement. So Jason, do you want to give a little bit more of your background, and then we'll jump right into the meat of the arguments here?
Sure. Thank you, Regina, for that kind introduction. I appreciate it, and I'm happy to be participating on this webinar today. So as Regina mentioned, I'm with IPS America, and we are a trade association that stands for promoting the research and deployment of intelligent transportation solutions and services. And my background is that I have been with IPS America since 2016. Before that, I spent 11 years at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce with as their senior telecom and e-commerce counsel, dealing with issues ranging from broadband to internet issues to privacy and data security. And here at IPS America, I work on external affairs, so talking to third parties and other stakeholders about the importance of intelligent transportation, and mobility issues, and also I manage our state chapter network. So with that, Regina, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks. All right, so let's get going. Why does Washington matter? Well, of course, it is all about the money. And so what we'd like to do is go through, trying to make this work. Josh, it won't change screens. Is there something? Sorry, everybody, I'm trying to use Zoom for the first time, and I can't get the screen to change. All right, well, while I'm doing that, let's talk about the federal legislative side while I try to catch up with you, Jason. The first issue that's on the table is it seems as if Washington, in particular on the legislative side, is not moving forward very quickly. And even though we've had an omnibus bill pass, which I'd like for you to talk about, sort of the different elements of the omnibus bill, let's start there and talk about what money was put forward in the omnibus bill, because there was money put forward, but not necessarily in the FAST Act, but some new money put forward to some deployment programs. So can we start there?
Sure, it's a great introduction. So yeah, so last month Congress passed the Omnibus Budget, which was signed by the President, and it included a lot of new money for DOT. The U.S. DOT received $27.3 billion in discretionary appropriations for fiscal year 2018. This is a $8.7 billion above the FY 2017 enacted level. So, you know, it's quite a significant amount of more money that U.S. DOT received. And just sort of going into some of the specifics, it included $47.5 billion for federal highway aid programs, including $45 billion from the Highway Trust Fund. And there was also a couple other things, so block grants, dealing with federal highways. So quite a bit of new and then old, but then also some old money that was repurposed from other programs. The bill continues a provision to allow old unused earmarks, or specifically designed funds that were designed to be used for something else to be repurposed for transportation projects. What we're focused on is safety and technology. And so NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, will receive $947 million, an increase of $36 million. So not too bad there. And the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration will receive $844.8 million, an increase of $201 million. Now, this is what Regina was alluding to earlier, is that key research and deployment programs were funded at authorized levels in the FAST Act. So basically, anything that was authorized in the FAST Act sort of formulate programs, those are sort of unchanged. And so the ITS program received $100 million, and also the Advanced Transportation and Congestion Management Technologies Deployment Program received $60 million, and there's some other money in there too. Interestingly, it did include money for self-driving vehicles. So inside the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration received $100 million for highly automated vehicle research and deployment program. And that includes, and of that, $60 million for demonstration grants to test the feasibility and safety of self-driving vehicles, and $38 million to research self-driving cars, including cybersecurity. And then, as I will go into a little later, included a significant amount of money for the Tiger grant programs. It tripled the size of this popular program, which is the Tiger stands for the Transportation Investment Generating Economic Recovery, Tiger. For FY 2018, the Tiger program will receive $1.5 billion, and that's actually a $1 billion increase. So quite a significant increase there. And what's sort of interesting about that is that President Trump's initial budget called for eliminating the Tiger program altogether. So as you see, Congress disagreed with that. And now I'll discuss a couple of telecom provisions that were in that, which I think are of significance to the people listening in here and viewing the webinar. As part of the Omnibus, it included a telecom bill called the Mobile Now Act, which stands for Making Opportunities for Broadband Investment and Limiting Excessive and Needless Obstacles to Wireless Act, or Mobile Now. Quite a mouthful there. And basically a number of things, but I'll focus on a few things here. One is it requires the state to identify a broadband utility coordinator to facilitate the broadband infrastructure right-of-way efforts within the state. And this which leads to coordinating statewide telecommunication and broadband plans and state and local transportation and land use plans. So basically coordinating all these agencies and all these plans that are being put together to include strategies to minimize repeated excavations that involve the installation of broadband infrastructure and right-of-way. And another name for this is dig once. Basically, the thought is that if you're going to be digging up a piece of road, why not put fiber in it anyway? Or why not put telecommunications, broadband infrastructure in it, so you're not digging up the road multiple times and causing disruptions for the citizens who travel over that roadway, and also digging it up only once. It's obviously in the end more economical. It does. Some of the state DOTs are a little bit iffy on that provision because they think of it as an unfunded mandate, because it requires them to sort of go along with it, even though there's no money from Washington for it. But in the end, it's something that a lot of folks who believe in. So that's that part of it. And then the broadband, and then it also includes money for rural broadband. Includes $600 million for rural broadband, looking at areas that are currently not served by any broadband service. And so what's important for this is that, we are looking at, as we move into a future where we have connected, not only autonomous vehicles, but connected vehicles, broadband and the ability to communicate to vehicles become more and more important. And so the more broadband we have, the better it is for everyone. So that is a summary of some of the provisions in the Omnibus.
All right. So far, I don't see any questions with regard to those two issues. I want to, and I hit the screen, so we're a little bit ahead, but with regard to the FAST Act itself, Jason, this comes up again in 2020, right? Which means that next year will be when we need to begin reauthorizing, re-lobbying the FAST Act. Is that correct?
That's correct. So yeah, the current FAST Act expires in 2020, so it'll need to be renewed in 2020, and so the process for that will begin in next year in 2019. You know, some of the main things in my organization, IPS America, is looking at is making sure that the eligibility for ITS, Intelligent Transportation Technologies, are eligible for all these different types of funding. Looking for the obviously continuation of the programs that are in there. And then if there's opportunities for more money, certainly we'd be supportive of that too. But so that is a debate, and that is a conversation that begins in earnest next year in 2019.
Okay. One other question with regard to broadband deployment, and with Congress taking a look at funding broadband deployment. Is that money that the states and the localities can actually pull on, or is this something that is going to require a certain level of matching funds from the state? How will this broadband deployment initiative actually work?
So I think it is. I have to double check that, but I think it is. It's a new program in addition to the current USDA broadband program. And so right now, currently, a lot of the money for broadband in rural areas comes from USDA. So I'll have to check. I don't have the provision right in front of me, but I do. But it is likely USDA. But I'll have to confirm that. I'll check later.
Okay, great. So if anyone has any questions with regard to the broadband deployment section of this, please let us know, and we will get back with you. All right. So local electoral politics play huge into the equation of money coming out of Washington with regard to the infrastructure bill itself. So Jason, tell us a little bit about the infrastructure bill, $1 trillion, $200 million that the administration would like to put forward.
So yes.
That the administration would like to put forward.
So the administration earlier this year put forth a plan calling for $200 billion in funding from the federal government, which would be leveraged to encourage $1 trillion or more dollars in funding and spending on infrastructure. I think for all intents and purposes, that bill hasn't gone anywhere yet for a variety of reasons, mainly because there was no proposal about how to pay for it. So that's really that's one of the issues that that held things up. And obviously there are other priorities. In terms of it sort of changed the way transportation funding has worked in the past by creating different buckets, like an innovation bucket, a rural bucket for different funds and different things like that. And so, considering Congress has its own constituents and its own way of doing things, the infrastructure program, the infrastructure bill as proposed by the president, has not made much headway. It is likely, though, that since infrastructure spending basically is a great political election year tool for politicians to say, look, I've done something for you, and it's good for the constituents. And so it's likely that we'll see different iterations of infrastructure bills. Maybe not one large bill, probably not one large infrastructure bill, but some smaller ones, whether it's sort of FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, a bill which has to be reauthorized this year, and also WRDA, which is a water bill. And there might be other opportunities too in terms of broadband bills and other things where you could basically take slices of what we covered in a big infrastructure bill and make it more palatable in terms of passing. So that's the way that's the way it seems to be going. Speaker Ryan hinted at that, or basically said that a month or so ago, and certainly all the news reports and everyone we've talked to seems to indicate that's the way it's going to be headed. But I certainly wouldn't. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish, please.
No, I certainly wouldn't discount the possibility of sort of at least a lot of talk about infrastructure, because infrastructure, again, it's an election year. Politicians want to, say they've done something for constituents, and infrastructure is something. The benefits of infrastructure are something that their constituents can immediately see, because everyone is stuck in congestion. Obviously, there are injuries and deaths associated with roads that need to be repaired, and things like that. So anything that can make congestion less and driving less painful is obviously a good election year topic to be discussing. But whether or not at this point, it's doubtful we'll see a big large piece of legislation on infrastructure.
So the talk then I just want to make sure that I'm understanding the talk about having a large infrastructure bill that's going to come out of the United States Congress in 2018 is low, but there may be other provisions, whether it be a water bill or an FAA bill, that would carry some additional funding. Is that sort of the Cliff Notes version?
It is, and you'll see bits and pieces, whether it's different parts of transportation, or whether it's one of the things the administration's been focused on is on permit streamlining, basically make the administrative process more efficient, so that you can reduce delays that are associated with building major infrastructure projects. And so we can discuss this a little bit later. But there was a recent memorandum of understanding between the federal agencies talking about streamlining the process. And the FCC has done the Federal Communications Commission has done some streamlining itself regarding permitting of broadband infrastructure. So again, I think the way I see it is that you will see piecemeal or bits of sort of ideas from the big infrastructure bill put forth, and some will have a greater chance of passing than others.
All right, all politics are local. The Trump administration, as you see here, is favoring funds in rural parts of the country. We know that over the course of the last couple of electoral cycles, that states, because the federal government can't figure out a way in which to pay for any additional transportation infrastructure funding. And we do want to put out that when the administration talks about infrastructure funding, infrastructure is broadly defined, right?
Correct. I mean, they consider they consider infrastructure to be broad. I mean, everything from traditional infrastructure such as aviation, surface transportation, to ports, but then obviously including broadband. At some point there was even discussion of veterans issues in terms of infrastructure. So they consider infrastructure as in a very broad sense of the word.
For everyone on the call, realize that infrastructure can be, in Washington, D.C. parlay, a whole lot of things other than what we may think of as traditional infrastructure. So to finish that sentence, or that question I was going to ask, which was the gas tax, both in the House and the Senate, you can almost go up on the Hill and say the words gas tax, and you pretty much get that sort of funding mechanism isn't going anywhere on the federal level, right?
That's correct. It's so the gas tax has not been raised in some time, and it's a political hot potato basically. It is they are a lot of there is obviously because they know that it's basically they could be face attack ads for basically saying they support a tax increase. And so if you're a Democrat, you don't want to face those attack ads. I mean, some Democrats are going to be supportive of it, but others are afraid that this will be used against them. And certain Republicans who have signed sort of the no tax pledge or things like that, are very skittish about raising basically any inkling that they've been favoring a tax increase. And of course, now it's even more complicated because we recently had, the budget, the tax cuts that were passed, late last year. And so, that now some of the groups that are sort of anti-tax are saying, well, basically, the government can't give it and take it back. And so there is a lot of, talk about, a lot of opposition to the gas tax, increasing the gas tax, because that would, the argument goes, defeat the purpose of the tax cut that the Republicans has passed, in 2017.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, with today's news that Speaker Ryan will not be seeking reelection, I think you can say that with regard to not just only transportation, but for a whole lot of other industry verticals, there's going to be a shift in focus from the substantive aspects to the political aspects, right?
Yes, absolutely. And so I think it's just important to note that, Congress hasn't raised the gas tax in 25 years. But I think almost half the states have raised gas tax since, in at least the past couple, maybe since 2013 or so, or since, in the last 10 years. You've seen a lot of states then take the lead on raising the tax, their local and state gas taxes to make up for some of that shortfall, at least in terms of what they're doing. So because a lot of the states have responsibility for funding their own infrastructure projects, and don't go to the federal dole or don't ask for federal money for some of their projects. So they have to raise their own money, whether it's bonds, a gas tax, or any other funding mechanisms. And so, there is, and so, some people support a gas tax, point to the fact that you've seen a lot of the states pass it, and there's been no political retribution against those politicians at the state level have passed it. And therefore, the analogy goes that therefore the federal politicians shouldn't be afraid to raise it as well. In fact, my old employer, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, is pitching a 25-cent gas tax increase. That would basically be a 5-cent increase over 5 years. So you go up 5 cents per year for 5 years, and they say that would raise $394 billion in revenue over 10 years. And they calculate that it only costs the average motorist about $9 a month. And so that's that obviously there's a debate. Unlikely to get much movement in Congress, considering it's an election year, but it's still a debate that'll be had at least in some quarters.
And there have been other initiatives talked about, repatriation of corporate taxes that went away pretty quickly as a one-time fix. The vehicle miles traveled, which doesn't set well in the more rural parts of the country where the current president tends to want to favor a lot of his public policy. So for those folks on the phone or on the webinar who are either local or state officials or work in local and state DOTs, know that more than likely at the federal level, you're not going to see much coming. And oddly enough, at the state level, those states that have been successful in pushing forth gas tax increases, the administration sees that as proof that the states can take their own initiative to raise the money. I think one of the things, even though we don't see an infrastructure bill maybe moving forward in its totality, it is important to note, Jason, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the administration is looking at, of the $1 trillion, only $200 billion being federal money, that it would be either state initiatives or public-private partnerships that would then drive the rest of that investment, right?
No, that's correct. And you raised an interesting point, too, under the Trump proposal, on the administration proposal, states that actually were able to raise their own revenue, got preferential treatment in terms of, how their projects they were seeking to be funded. And so if a state could say, they were going to fund a certain portion of it, and so that they got a point in their favor for their project, or for there was an encouragement among at least in the Trump proposal and the administration proposal for as you mentioned, for public-private partnerships for states that took the initiative in terms of raising the gas tax or bonds or different ways to fund these things, and then the federal government would then sort of complement that funding as well.
Okay, so finally on this, then the difference between traditional and new infrastructure, this has a little to do with funding. I mean, we talked about the ITS portion in the prior conversation, but are pilots making a difference with regard to how Congress and the regulators see intelligent transportation, new mobility, and asked a different way? Are the autonomous issues that have been certainly the most recent Uber issue in Arizona, or the issue where the garbage truck ran into the autonomous shuttle in Las Vegas, are those having a negative impact at all?
We'll take that we'll analyze a couple different ways, I think. So one is, pilots are great. They show that, they're basically the demonstration projects. They show that it's there. But then again, we've been looking at ITS and all these different a lot of these different technologies, not so much the automated vehicles, but other ITS technologies, for a long time. And so there is some thinking in Washington among politicians and policymakers that when are we going to get to deployment rather than research? And so when pilots if they're actually deployment based, those make a huge difference. So one of the things that I would encourage everyone who's on the webinar today is when you're talking to folks who are making policy, emphasize that we're not in a research phase anymore, at least in a lot of these different things. We're actually deploying these technologies. Yes, there may still be evolutions of technology. Research may continue to be had on them to go forward with them, but these technologies are deployable now. They're not just in a research phase because some of the fights that we're having on ITS, especially on the connected vehicle side, is that people think we've been discussing these things for a decade, and yet we're not making any real progress, and that can't be as far that's the furthest from the truth. We made a lot of progress. There's a lot of different deployments out there, and so I think we need to start talking about deployments rather than and speaking of what's being done in terms of boots on the ground, in terms of projects that are actually being deployed. Regarding the AVs, I think again we're certainly in a testing phase. Some are further along than others. Deployment. I don't think the recent incidents have slowed down a lot of talk. Obviously they created some a news cycle or two. And created some hiccups along the way in terms of where we are. And actually, I'll talk about the AV bill right now. It's probably a good opportunity to talk about it. So both the House and Senate have their own AV bills. The House passed their bill last year on automated vehicles. The Senate Commerce Committee passed their bill. The committee passed in the Senate, and it's waiting for consideration by the full Senate. And so there are some issues to be worked out. In terms of some of the states and local, so some issues with it. Some of the politicians have questions about the safety of the technology. But I think overall, I think what it showed us, what these sort of incidents in Tempe and Arizona and others have showed us, is that we need a national framework for these technologies to be tested and deployed, or to be deployed. So to the extent that we have a national framework, I think it's better for everyone. And so, we're hopeful, and we continue at IPS America to push forward on the AV bill.
NTSB investigations, let's just stay there on the autonomous issues. NTSB investigations that are underway, there are a couple. You want to address those? And then I had an interesting conversation with the Leslie Richards, who is the Secretary of Transportation in Pennsylvania. So let's address it from the federal level, and then I'll throw in some insights from the state level.
Sure. So NTSB, the National Safety and Transportation Board, they mainly look at airline crashes, train crashes, bus incidents, crashes, and things like that. But they are investigating the few incidents that we've had on the AV space. The Tempe, Arizona one, the incident in Las Vegas, and there was one in California as well, all in the past several months, with the one in Tempe, Arizona, and Uber being the most recent and the most one that garnered the most news attention. So I would say that really, basically, I think from our point of view is it shows that the federal government is not taking a hands-on approach. They are going in there. They're looking at what could have been done better, what could have done, what companies could have done more. And so basically, to me, it emphasizes that the government is not taking a hands-off approach. That there is a government role for all this, and that for the people arguing that the government there's the companies are having their way and there's no oversight. I would say that's the incorrect conclusion. The government is taking sort of a look at all these incidents and examining it. We'll come out with full reports with recommendations, and so that's what I take away from the NTSB investigations.
And so to add to that, I had a conversation this morning with Leslie Richards, who's Secretary at PennDOT, who said that they just made an announcement this week with regard to dealing with their autonomous vehicle pilots in the Pennsylvania area, in Pittsburgh in particular, that they have now issued a new regulation, and you may want to go out and take a look at it, that basically states that If there is an NTSB investigation underway, that any private pilots that are operating will then cease until the NTSB either releases some sort of a regulatory framework under which they can continue, or the state decides that it has enough evidence to move forward. And in talking with her about this morning, she stated that they did have a conversation with Uber about this, and that Uber was receptive to this. So that was an interesting development where we see states now trying to balance moving forward with these pilots and taking proactive steps to make sure that these new mobility technologies can move forward, but also making sure that the safety elements are balanced with it as well. So if you haven't seen that out of Pennsylvania this week, you may want to go take a look. Also on autonomous, Jason, we've got the NHTSA AV 3.0. You want to break that down for us?
Sure. As many of you may know, under the previous administration, the sort of first federal automated vehicle policy came out in fall of 2016, and then there was a second iteration of that came out last year, which is basically sort of wrapped up some of the comments that were received on the first version. And now this administration is trying to put their own sort of formal stamp on it, with coming out with a 3.0 policy. And over the past couple of months, there's been a series of comment proceedings at the USDOT asking for comment, whether it's from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to Federal Highway Federal Highways to the Federal Transit Administration. There's been a series of comment periods and requests for comments, and so I think there's actually some on the railroads as well, and there's some different other proceedings going on, all sort of geared toward providing input into the next iteration of the FAVP, the Federal Automated Vehicle Policy. And so, and when it comes out, I haven't quite heard, but they're certainly working on it. And I think March 1st, they had a big summit at USDOT with sort of high-profile panelists talking about what they would like to see in a sort of 3.0 version of the policy and what's going on. And there's been several other different policy workshops and at USDOT, and so we're waiting to see what comes out from the department, which hopefully be not too far away.
Okay, so autonomous is one side of the equation. Connectivity is on the other side of the equation. So V2I, or vehicle to infrastructure, V2V, vehicle to vehicle. What's happening on the legislative side with regard to any legislative efforts, or just hearings and talk on the Hill? Because I know a lot of people love to talk about autonomous. Everybody wants to talk about the future of autonomous vehicles, and vehicle to vehicle or vehicle to infrastructure may not be as sexy of a topic, but what are you hearing on the Hill about those two issues?
Let's see. We'll start with vehicle infrastructure. So that's one of the things that we're looking at, because under the Omnibus bill, budget bill, there was obviously a significant amount of money for highway construction, and there is some debate whether or not V2I can be funded under those provisions. And so we've been told by the relevant congressional staff and others that some of this will be at the discretion of the USDOT in terms of the rules that are actually implementing some of the funding opportunities that come out of the Omnibus bill. And so I think IPS America and others will be in touch with USDOT to encourage them to make sure that vehicle infrastructure funding can be in there. Because as of now, there was some doubt about the eligibility for vehicle infrastructure among some of the new funding that came out of the Omnibus. So that's just one note of caution, because obviously there is a emphasis on build, let's build, and we want to see we want to see bridges, we want to see highways, and not so much about the the insides or what's the sort of the technology side of things. But obviously one of our ITS America we have a lot of you can't always build your way out of congestion and out of limited space. So technology can be a solution, and also allows you more bang for the buck in terms of good use of public funds. Vehicle to vehicle in terms of Congress, not so much activity in that area. They're waiting to see what NHTSA does, and also the FCC. NHTSA does have a proceeding open on V2V, vehicle to vehicle, and there's a comment period that was closed last year, and there is, that's where, it's still basically pending with the administration. And then there's a sort of a related issue at the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, where they're looking at whether or not the spectrum for vehicle to vehicle, spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz range could be shared with Wi-Fi, wireless devices, wireless broadband devices. And there was a proceeding on that. Last we heard was that their Office of Engineering Technology, the FCC's Office of Engineering Technology, had was wrapping up a report, and they were making edits to it. And they said, well, it should be released soon. Question is, what does soon mean? And then what happens in the report? So the staff has told us, or staff has hinted that there's not going to be any policy recommendations in it, but that doesn't mean that the commissioners themselves couldn't use that report to argue for a decision or sort of a direction that they want the sharing to take place. Because as some of you may know, some of the commissioners have been very antagonistic or hostile to the safety spectrum, as we call it, the 5.9 spectrum for V2V and V2I. Because they were saying it's not flexible. They said, we've basically been sitting on this technology for a decade. Where is it? We point to them that there are there are vehicle to infrastructure, vehicle to vehicle deployments in about 26 states or so. And obviously we point to them to the safety benefits of all of this technology, but it's an ongoing fight at the FCC. For those of you on the phone who understand this issue, I would encourage you to be vocal in your support for the technology, for talking about the need for it as well, and then it's actually out there and being deployed, or will be deployed, and it's not just sitting there being unused in terms of the spectrum. So that's Jason, where we are on V2I. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, let me. I think this issue, the DSRC issue, whether you say DSRC versus 5G or LTE or whatever an alternative mechanism may be. It seems like this one issue, anywhere I go, whether it be on a panel, on the Hill, just talking to folks, all the podcasts that we do, this is the one thing that drives so much intense conversation. And I think it's around this issue, and we have it here, called regulatory paralysis, which is, do we see a lack of investment or a lack of initiative around the fact that the FCC and frankly the DOT have not really come together on this issue? Are people hesitating with regard to investment, with regard to deployment, saying, well, I guess we need to wait on the FCC? Or is there the alternative argument that manufacturers are making their products adaptable to both the current DSRC model and potential future technologies?
So I would say to that, it's a good question. There are basically two camps. One is that there are state DOTs and others who are committed to this technology and are moving forward, whether it's Michigan or New York City in terms of their pilot project, or others who are moving forward with DSRC testing and deployment of the technology. And certainly there are other agencies and other projects going on. And so those states have decided they're going to go forward with this. They want to be leaders, and because they see the benefits of technology and they want it out there. Then there, of course, there are other agencies out there that haven't made much investment yet in DSRC, and so these, and so there, because now they have not made this investment yet, so now they're very skittish because they don't want to start making this investment and then have the the FCC or USDOT pull the rug out from under them in terms of, all right, we've made an investment, oops, and then the government says back off and let's try something else, and meanwhile you've wasted the public dollars. So that's really where it's at. I think the regulatory paralysis is a real thing. Some states are going forward regardless of that because they've already made the investment and then they don't want to turn around and back off from it. But in the others who haven't made that investment, I think there is some, obviously they don't want to start it and then be accused of poor management of the public dollars.
So, with regard to this issue, we spoke with Walter White from Verizon, one of the two largest carriers in the country, and he was talking about the issues around the deployment of 5G, not only just the amount of infrastructure capital that it requires, and it was in the billions, if I remember correctly, but the fact that 5G is very site located, right? It's very site centric. So that the type of deployment mechanisms that have to be used for 5G are so much different than what we're used to in older forms, more older forms of technology. Describe a little bit about what you're hearing on the telecommunications side, getting out of the pure transportation side, on where we are with 5G and how much of a promise it is that this is actually coming to us anytime soon, especially in the rural areas.
So, 5G is coming. The carriers, AT&T, Verizon, and others have, I think, announced this year some, at least a few cities where we're going to make them available in 2018. And then what's really going to drive the deployment is obviously the introduction of devices that can use the spectrum, which is not expected till 2019 at the or maybe, but 2019 is what I've been hearing. And so it's a complicated process. There are issues. So the way the 5G works is instead of having one big cell tower out there, it requires lots of smaller antennas that are more closely put together. They're called small cells. And so there's been a lot of different debate about at the state level and at the federal level about streamlining the permitting rules regarding the siting of these antennas. Because obviously, if you don't have the wireless infrastructure to transmit and receive these signals, then the technology can't go anywhere. And so last month the FCC looked at it at a federal issue. At the federal level, they issued an order streamlining NEPA review, the National Environmental Policy Act review, as well as the National Historic Preservation Act. And also issues related to land that's outside tribal locations or tribal land, but actually not part of any reservation. So there are, so they're looking at that. There have been proposals in Congress that would try to limit or streamline, the permitting process at the local and state level. Obviously, that has run into resistance from the state and local groups. But on the local and state level, what you have seen on the state level is state attempts to take away the authority from local governments and put in the hands of the state in terms of creating the rules and requirements for permitting. So a lot of states have adopted that approach, and obviously there's been a lot of debate about that. There's always a tension between the states and the cities regarding how basically the control of the city or how much influence the state has over city and local policies. And so this is another aspect of the debate.
Well, it certainly is a huge debate. Ran into one of the commissioners at an event here in Washington the other day, and the first thing that he said was, please don't ask me a question about DSRC. It wasn't like, hi, how are you doing? everything doing well. It's just please don't ask me a question about it. So we know that it's definitely a hot topic. Just a reminder for folks that are watching and listening, you can ask a question in the Q&A section if you so choose. So just a reminder to do that. All right, so we've talked about, Jason, we've talked about the federal legislative side of where we are in money, the federal regulatory side on where we are with potentially a regulatory paralysis, therefore a paralysis of investment of money, and what it means for the broadband carriers to invest. Let's talk a little bit about smart cities and where we are. In the Obama administration, the United States DOT held the Smart Cities Challenge. It was very successful with the winning city being Columbus, Ohio, and now Columbus is working through ways in which it can utilize that money, which remind me of a figure. I think when they bumped it up with the matching dollars, it was quite a bit of money that Columbus now has to work with. But so now we're into the Trump administration, where maybe it's not smart cities, maybe it's smart communities, and it feels that both on the legislative and the regulatory side, that the Hill and the regulatory agencies have sort of caught up with where DOT was a few years ago in promoting smart cities and smart communities being the word of the day under the Trump administration. Let's start on the legislative side. Where are we both in legislative filings, but also in the reality of any legislation around smart cities, smart communities?
So sure, no, smart community. So IPS America has been very focused on smart communities. We do call it smart communities because, you know, it encompasses cities, states, regions, corridors, metro areas. You know, there are lots of different ways you could define a smart community. That includes all of those different geographic descriptions. And so there are three main bills, I would say, and with various data support regarding them. You know, the first was introduced in draft form in 2016, introduced in 2017. This is called the Smart Cities and Communities Act of 2017, sponsored by Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington, Democrat from Washington, and Representatives Susan DelBene and Democrat from Washington State, and then Congressman Lujan from Democrat from New Mexico. You know, that bill did a lot. Basically, it was you know, it looked at coordinating federal activities on smart communities, basically using NIST and other as a sort of a clearinghouse for different projects in terms of creating a database of sort of funding and other federal initiatives that could be classified as smart communities related. And then, you know, that bill, for whatever reason, has not garnered a Republican co-sponsor, either in the Senate or in the House. So it's sort of sitting there right now, pending. And then the next bill, you have two other bills which were introduced sort of last year in 2017, both of which, you know, we've been focusing on. One is the Moving and Fostering Innovation to Revolutionize Smarter Transportation, otherwise known as the Moving First Act, sponsored by Senators Burr, Republican from North Carolina, and Senator Cortez Masto, from a Democrat from Nevada on the Senate side, and then on the House side, Representatives Smucker, a Republican from Pennsylvania, and then also a Democrat from California. And so that bill basically would seek to put in the legislation the Smart Cities Challenge that US DOT did in 2016. And so it creates a grant program, very similar criteria as the USDT Smart City Challenge. And then there's a third bill, which is the Smart Technology for Resilient, Efficient, Economic, and Reliable Transportation in Cities and Communities Act. Easier way of referring to it is the Street Act, so otherwise known as the Street Act, which is in the House, is sponsored by Representative Comstock, Republican from Virginia, and Congresswoman Etsy from Connecticut, Democrat. And it would do a combination of both the Moving First and the Smart Cities Communities Act. Basically, it would create a grant program for a Smart Cities Challenge 2.0. We would also do some other things like coordination of federal activities and different things like that. And coordinating, basically creating, offering technical assistance to states and localities that were interested in doing smart communities. So where we are is again, well, it's two things. One is money. A lot of these bills require, funding either as part of grants to cities or actually challenge in terms of the grant, in terms of competitive grants. And so, a lot of them we're going to depend upon being part of a larger infrastructure bill. So that's where we are, is until some infrastructure bill vehicle becomes available for this kind of legislation to be attached to or morphed into. In terms of the funding issue, that's been the one holding point. And then one thing that we've been focused on at ITS America is making sure larger cities were eligible to participate in these programs. Because there was some talk that larger cities, whether you're cities above 1 million, wouldn't need any federal funding because they get enough from the private sector or governments, and basically they have enough funding. However, what those proponents do forget is that there are pockets of even those big cities, which are transit deserts, which have populations that aren't well served and could really benefit from some of these technologies. And so where we are working with the various authors of these bills to encourage them to lift the cap in terms of population size that would be eligible. And there are a variety of ways to do that. You can say, all right, cities over 400,000. You could do a metro area. There are various ways that you accomplish that. And so we're working with ITS America members as well as Senate and House staff on that. And so that's where the bills stand.
So there's a lot of action and interest on the Hill, but I guess the money is actually tied to the infrastructure bill or other bills that may be floating around out there that in other words, I guess my question is there's no real money on the table yet, right?
Right. I mean, so there are ways to fund it. So it's, you can get new money through, an infrastructure bill. You could, you could reprogram money from within USDOT, from it. That's something I don't, there's certainly obviously concerns with that, taking money from worthy projects and putting it toward this. So that's obviously raises some concerns if you do that. We're not going to take money from the highway from the highway trust fund to do this. So yeah, I think we're looking for, new money or cost savings or some other way of funding these projects. And so, obviously we're, the pay fors is what, technically how they're described for is, we're obviously paying attention to those and seeing what kind of pay for, or new money, might be used to fund these projects. Some of this stuff though could be done without any cost, or minimal cost, coordination of federal government, creating a task force, interagency working group, to reduce or to consolidate smart cities efforts. Because one of the things that we've talking to our members, we've seen is that, okay, well, EPA may have a program for pollution mitigation. That may not be classified as a smart city program, but in fact it is, because you can use sensors and things like that. Same thing in health and human services. So there are things you could do that are minimal cost. Basically just cost of oversight, to do some of these things without creating a whole new financial burden or looking for new money. So that's where we are. Obviously, agencies already are providing support and standards on some of these issues. I mean, NIST is doing a lot in this area. They've got the Global City Team Challenge, the GCTC, which has been going on for several years. This year they've actually teamed up with Department of Homeland Security to look at cybersecurity and smart cities. So again, there are things that could be done more, whether they're just, they're working on these things sort of, agency to agency, and you could formalize the process by enshrining it in legislation. So, there are prospects, even if funding doesn't come through, you could see, sort of more limited smart cities legislation passed.
Yeah, and along that line, I'm glad that you mentioned what NIST is doing, because for those of you on the webinar who have not looked into this and you're interested in it, it goes beyond just the smart cities concepts, as Jason said. So please go on to the NIST website. It's the National Institute for Standards and Technology, and take a look at what they're doing. Just to give you a couple of examples, in St. Louis, they're now doing a cluster and an action cluster around electric cabs. So utilizing low-speed electric vehicles to provide sort of those last mile solutions. In Kansas City, Verizon and Sensity is working with the city to talk about the IoT platform and energy efficiency in the platform. In San Jose, California, there's a web-based platform where they're testing new technologies for cities and making communities come together. And they're also doing things for those of you who work on the international sphere. There's also projects in Singapore and in New Zealand. And so it's worth, if you're interested in this area, whether it be purely just from the understanding perspective, or if you are a local or state community development project personnel, or if you're really pushing forward a product, take a look at what's happening with NIST. The other thing that I would push forward for you to look at in this area is, because all things are local and it seems like on the federal level, you have initiatives, but they don't always come together in a way that can push itself down. The governors, who like to think of themselves as sort of the test beds of innovation, through the National Governors Association, is now putting together a Smart Cities, Smart Communities project, which will allow you to work with governors across the country over the course of the next 2 years to develop smart cities planning and putting together basically a roadmap, which will then be pushed down to the states. And it's an effort to try to coordinate and not to reinvent the wheel. So if you're interested in what's happening on the National Governors Association side or at that state level, take a look at the NGA as well. So, okay, so with that, we have gone through the legislative side, we have gone through the regulatory side on the federal level, we've tried to hit on some local and state initiatives. And so I know that we haven't had too many questions put forward, but something, Jason, that I've been asked is, what's really going to happen with regard to ITS and funding for the future? As we look forward to the FAST Act, as we look forward to how to drive money into ITS or technology-driven solutions, you want to take a guess at what we're looking at for the future? With regard
Sure. I mean, this will be the topic of debate when we reauthorize the FAST Act beginning next year. There is a debate about whether about whether some of these technologies are now mature enough that they should be included as part of the traditional, basically part of the non-technology specific program. So if you're going to build a highway, technology should be part of it. I mean, the best analogy that I've heard lately is that if you're building an office building, a decade ago, you built the office building and then you invite your IT department to come in and figure out how to wire it. Now, when you're planning the office building, the IT is integrated into the planning stage. Comes in right early and is integrated into the design of the building. Similarly, some of the technologies that we're talking about are no longer research. They're deployable, they're advanced, they're mature, and so there'll be some question of some of these technologies whether or not you need sort of technology-specific programs, or whether or not you should just be eligible within within sort of regular funding. Of course, another camp would say that we continue to need dedicated funding for these projects, and so I mean some of the debate, so some of those issues have been raised when we've gone in and talking about the infrastructure bill, and obviously that leads into a discussion about the FAST Act and other funding opportunities. Look, I think we're hopeful. I mean, we don't see any reason why the FAST Act shouldn't be reauthorized and in fact even increased. But there certainly is a a debate, or at least to talk about. And some of it is, some of it's regarding the smart cities, going back to the smart cities bill. We've had discussions lately along with policymakers and congressional staff about the difference between the funding and what's being proposed in the smart cities bills and what the programs are in the FAST Act. So, there's questions about, whether or not just sort of formulaic programs are better, or surge programs where you get a lot of attention, you create competition, you create a lot of buzz, you get private sector funding. We're basically the Columbus model, for example. The government gave $40 million and then 10 from a company called Vulcan, and then raised $90 million from the private-public partnership on the Columbus side, and they've now sort of got pledges of up to $500 million for that. Versus the traditional formulaic programs, or even congestion, or even some of the other smaller grant programs like some of the other ones that are FAST Act, which are smaller, like maximum $12 million per grantee, and so there's debate, but I think obviously at ITS America we'll be continuing to encourage funding for ITS. And people do recognize the importance of technology, because you can't build your way out of congestion. And obviously there are the safety aspects as well.
And there are indeed. And so this will continue, of course, because Washington will continue, and work on the state and local level will as well. So Jason, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, and your time with us today. And I know that Jason would be more than happy to answer any of your questions. So you see his email address there if you need to reach out to him. And we want to thank all of you who joined us as well to take a listen to what's going on and where the money is, and maybe where the money isn't. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me or Jason with any ideas moving forward. Finally, we want to remind you that we do a biweekly podcast called Policy Smart. You can download that on either the Apple App Store or Google Play, and you can also download it on Apple as well. And we are really proud to announce that we are now on Spotify. So if you want to take a deeper look into some of these questions, as a matter of fact, Jason just did the most recent podcast with us, and we dove more into these issues on that. So take a listen to that on Policy Smart. So with that, we'll wrap up, and thank you all so much, and we'll all talk soon. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Regina. Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.